Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're enjoying the kind of stories we share here, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this is reaching. In the medieval world, life was shaped by rhythms that had little to do with clocks and everything to do with the sun, the seasons, and the church bell. Dawn was not just the start of a workday but the first signal of communal movement. With fires being stoked, animals fed, and the day's chores planned before breakfast, people lived closely with the land, and the majority of the population worked as peasants tied to manors or villages. Whether a serf or a free tenant, the responsibilities were relentless, including tilling fields, planting, harvesting, and maintaining tools. The village itself was small and tightly knit, with simple timber and wattle houses topped with thatch. Privacy was rare, and life was communal in every sense. The scent of wood smoke mixed with damp earth was constant, and daily conversation often revolved around weather, crops, and the latest word from the Lord Steward. The sounds of medieval life were an unending background score, with the creak of wagon wheels over muddy tracks, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle in the pasture, and the toll of the church bell marking prayer times. For most villagers, the church was the spiritual and social center of existence. It was where announcements were made, disputes mediated, and festivals celebrated. Religion was not a separate sphere of life but intertwined with every activity, from planting crops to healing sickness. Illness was often explained through both spiritual and practical terms, with prayers offered alongside herbal remedies. Most people never traveled beyond the nearest market town, so local news and gossip were vital links to the outside world. In the evenings, villagers gathered around the hearth, swapping tales or singing songs, their voices competing with the howling of wolves in the distance during the long winter nights. Food in medieval times depended heavily on status, season, and location. Peasants relied on bread as a staple, made from barley, rye, or oats, rather than the refined wheat flour enjoyed by the wealthy. Meals were simple, with pottage being a thick vegetable and grain stew that was common, supplemented by whatever could be grown in the garden or foraged from the woods. Meat was rare for commoners and often came from hunting small game or raising a few chickens. Preservation was crucial, with salting, smoking, and drying ensuring food lasted through harsh winters. Nobles, in contrast, enjoyed lavish banquets with roasted game, imported spices, and wine brought from distant lands. Table manners reflected class as well, with nobles eating from trenchers of fine bread or silver, while peasants used wooden bowls. Hunger was never far away for the poor, and a bad harvest could mean famine, with grain prices soaring and entire villages facing desperate scarcity. Clothing in the medieval period spoke volumes about one's place in the social hierarchy. Peasants wore garments made from coarse wool or linen, dyed in muted colors from natural sources like onion skins or madder root. Their outfits were practical, designed for long hours of labor in fields or workshops. Nobles and royalty displayed their status through vibrant silks, velvets, and furs, often imported at great expense. Laws known as sumptuary laws dictated what fabrics and colors each class could wear, ensuring visual separation between social ranks. Shoes for peasants were simple leather or wooden clogs, while wealthier citizens wore soft leather or embroidered slippers. Clothes were often patched and repurposed for years, handed down through families until they were no longer wearable. For the poor, owning more than 2 sets of clothing was rare, while the rich had wardrobes for different seasons, hunting attire, and ceremonial dress for courtly occasions. Housing reflected the deep divide between classes. A peasant's home was usually a single-room structure with a thatched roof and walls made of wattle and daub. The floor might be packed dirt, covered with rushes or straw that were replaced periodically. A central hearth provided heat and light, though the smoke often lingered inside, darkening beams and stinging eyes. Furniture was minimal, often handmade, and shared by the entire family. In contrast, nobles lived in stone manors or castles with multiple rooms, fortified walls, and large fireplaces. They had separate spaces for sleeping, eating, and entertaining, with tapestries on the walls to keep out the cold and display wealth. While castles offered protection, they could also be drafty and damp, with the scent of burning tallow candles mixing with that of the kitchens and stables. Comfort was relative, and even the richest households lacked the luxuries of plumbing or central heating that we take for granted today. Daily work varied by gender and season, but it was constant. Men spent their days farming, tending livestock, repairing tools, or performing skilled labor like carpentry or smithing. Women's responsibilities were equally demanding, involving cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, making clothing, tending gardens, and helping with the harvest when needed. Children contributed from a young age, herding animals, gathering firewood, or working in the fields. In towns, craftsmen and merchants had workshops that bustled with trade, and apprenticeships were the path to learning a trade. The agricultural calendar dictated much of the rhythm of life, with planting, harvesting, and winter preparation filling the year. Bad weather or crop failure could bring hardship to everyone, and community cooperation was essential for survival. Work began at sunrise and ended at sunset, with few breaks and little opportunity for leisure outside of holy days or community festivals, which were treasured escapes from the monotony of labor. Education was rare and largely reserved for the clergy and the wealthy. Most peasants were illiterate, relying on oral traditions to pass down knowledge, stories, and skills. Noble children might be tutored in reading, writing, Latin, and the management of estates, while boys destined for knighthood were trained in martial skills from an early age. Monasteries and cathedral schools served as the primary centers of learning, preserving classical texts and producing new works on theology, law, and medicine. Apprenticeships and towns provided practical training, passing skills from master to apprentice in exchange for years of service. Learning for commoners came primarily from experience and necessity, such as understanding the seasons for farming or the uses of medicinal herbs. The divide in education reinforced the social hierarchy, making upward mobility rare. Even so, the spread of ideas through merchants, travelers, and religious missions meant that knowledge, while limited, was never entirely confined to the elite. Religion was at the core of medieval life. The church not only guided spiritual matters, but also influenced politics, education, and law. The calendar was filled with feast days, saints' days, and holy observances, providing structure to the year. Moral behavior was judged according to church teachings, and confessions and penance were routine. Pilgrimages to holy sites offered both spiritual reward and social prestige, though such journeys were expensive and dangerous. Monks and nuns lived in religious communities, dedicating their lives to prayer, labor, and study, while parish priests tended to the needs of local congregations. Religious art and architecture flourished, with cathedrals rising over towns as symbols of faith and community pride. Yet the church also held significant economic power, collecting tithes from the faithful. For many, religion provided comfort and meaning in a world where life was often short and unpredictable, and the promise of heaven offered hope beyond earthly struggles. Festivals and fairs provided welcome relief from the demands of daily life. These gatherings were vibrant affairs filled with music, dancing, feasting, and games. Markets offered goods from distant lands, and entertainers performed for crowds. From jugglers to traveling minstrels, religious festivals, tied to the liturgical calendar, combined solemn ceremonies with communal celebration. Fairs were also opportunities for trade and networking, drawing merchants, farmers, and craftsmen together. In rural areas, seasonal festivals marked key moments in the agricultural year, such as planting or harvest. Competitions like archery contests or wrestling matches were popular, and village greens often became impromptu arenas. The excitement of these events lingered long after, becoming part of local stories and traditions. For many, these gatherings were some of the few times when social boundaries blurred, as lords and peasants alike participated in the same celebrations, sharing food, drink, and music in a rare sense of communal unity. Health and medicine in the medieval period were shaped by a mix of herbal knowledge, superstition, and limited understanding of disease. Illness was often attributed to imbalances in the four humors, bad air, or divine punishment. Remedies included herbal infusions, poultices, and bleeding, as well as prayers and charms. Midwives assisted in childbirth, while barber surgeons performed basic surgeries and tooth extractions. Access to professional medical care was rare outside of wealthy households or monasteries, which sometimes ran infirmaries. Plagues and epidemics, such as the Black Death, could devastate entire communities, spreading rapidly in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Clean water was a challenge in many towns, and waste disposal was often inadequate. Despite these limitations, communities developed practical health practices, such as boiling certain foods, using herbs to repel pests, and isolating the sick when possible. Survival often depended as much on luck and resilience as on any available treatment. Law and order varied greatly between regions, but justice was often swift and severe. Local lords or appointed officials presided over courts, handling disputes ranging from theft to land boundaries. Punishments could be harsh, including fines, public shaming, mutilation, or execution, depending on the crime. Trial by ordeal, such as carrying hot iron or retrieving stones from boiling water, was sometimes used to determine guilt, based on the belief that divine intervention would protect the innocent. In towns, guilds maintained order among their members, and watchmen patrolled streets at night. Peasants relied on communal agreements and mutual trust to maintain peace, as professional law enforcement was rare. Disputes could also be resolved through mediation by church officials, whose influence extended into civil matters. The fear of crime and disorder was balanced by the reality that most medieval communities were small and interdependent, making cooperation essential for everyone's survival. Travel in the medieval period was slow, challenging, and often dangerous. Most people never ventured far from their birthplace, but merchants, pilgrims, and messengers routinely braved long journeys. Roads were uneven, muddy in wet seasons, and plagued by bandits. Travelers often joined caravans for safety, sharing expenses and protection. Horses, mules, or oxen pulled carts laden with goods, while wealthier individuals might ride in relative comfort on horseback. Inns were scattered along major routes, offering food and shelter for a price, though they could be noisy and crowded. For many, the primary destinations were market towns, fairs, or religious sites. Pilgrimages to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome could take weeks or months, requiring careful planning and faith in divine protection. River travel was faster and more comfortable when possible, with barges carrying both passengers and cargo. Every journey carried risk, yet travel also brought news, ideas, and opportunities for trade. Towns and cities in the medieval era were bustling centers of commerce, though they were often cramped, noisy, and unsanitary. Streets were narrow and winding, flanked by tall timber-framed houses that sometimes leaned precariously over the road. Markets formed the heart of urban life, where merchants sold spices, fabrics, tools, and fresh produce. Guilds regulated trades, ensuring quality and protecting their members' livelihoods. The air was filled with the scent of baked bread, roasting meat, and less pleasant odors from waste tossed into the streets. Town criers delivered news and proclamations, their voices competing with the clamor of carts and the calls of hawkers. Entertainment came in the form of traveling performers, religious plays, and public festivals. While cities offered greater opportunity than rural villages, they also brought challenges such as overcrowding, fire hazards, and the rapid spread of disease. Still, the promise of prosperity drew many from the countryside to seek their fortunes. The feudal system underpinned much of medieval society, structuring relationships between kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. At the top sat the monarch, granting land to powerful lords in exchange for loyalty and military service. These lords, in turn, oversaw manors worked by peasants, many of whom were serfs bound to the land. The system created mutual obligations, with peasants providing labor and produce while receiving protection from their lords' knights. Though this arrangement ensured stability, it also limited personal freedom for the lower classes. Opportunities to rise within the hierarchy were rare, though exceptional service in battle or skill in trade could lead to advancement. Feudal bonds were reinforced by oaths, ceremonies, and the ever-present influence of the Church, which sanctified the order of society. While the system varied across Europe, its core principles of landholding, loyalty, and obligation remained a defining feature of the medieval world for centuries. Knighthood was one of the most prestigious roles in medieval society, blending martial skill with ideals of honor, loyalty, and chivalry. Training began in childhood, often starting as a page in the household of a noble, where boys learned manners, horsemanship, and basic combat skills. By adolescence, they became squires, assisting knights in tournaments and on the battlefield, while honing their own abilities in swordsmanship, lancework, and strategy. The path to knighthood culminated in a ceremonial dubbing, often during a religious service. Knights swore to protect their lord, uphold justice, and defend the church, though in reality their actions could be as pragmatic as they were noble. They fought in wars, participated in tournaments, and served as symbols of power. Armor evolved over time, from chainmail to full plate, providing both protection and an imposing presence. The life of a knight was demanding, balancing military duties with the expectations of chivalric conduct. Tournaments were among the most thrilling spectacles of the medieval age, combining sport, training, and public entertainment. Jousting, where two armored knights charged at each other with lances, was the most famous event, but melee battles, archery contests, and other martial games also drew crowds. These events allowed knights to display their prowess, win prizes, and gain prestige. Nobles sponsored tournaments as demonstrations of wealth and power, with lavish feasts and celebrations accompanying the competitions. The atmosphere was vibrant, with banners fluttering, musicians playing, and vendors selling food and trinkets. While tournaments were regulated to reduce fatalities, injuries were common, and some contests could turn deadly. For the audience, they were more than sport. They were a chance to see the ideals of knighthood in action, to cheer for local champions, and to celebrate the martial culture that defined much of medieval Europe. The castle was the ultimate symbol of power in the medieval landscape. Built of stone for strength and defense, castles dominated their surroundings, serving as both military fortresses and residences for nobility. Their high walls, towers, and gatehouses were designed to withstand sieges, while moats and drawbridges added further protection. Inside, great halls hosted feasts, courts, and gatherings, with tapestries and hearths providing warmth and color. Castles also housed chapels, storerooms, and living quarters for servants, soldiers, and the lord's family. Life within a castle was far from idle. Maintaining defenses, managing supplies, and training troops required constant attention. In times of peace, castles were centers of administration, overseeing the surrounding lands and collecting taxes. They stood as visible reminders of authority, projecting power over the countryside and serving as rallying points in times of conflict. For those who lived within, they were both home and fortress. Sieges were among the most grueling aspects of medieval warfare, testing the endurance of both attackers and defenders. Armies would surround a fortified location, cutting off supplies and attempting to breach its defenses through force or attrition. Siege engines such as trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers were brought into play, hurling stones, fire, or disease-ridden carcasses over the walls. Defenders relied on thick walls, boiling oil, and arrows to repel assaults, while rationing food and water to withstand the blockade. Sieges could last weeks, months, or even years, with starvation and disease often deciding the outcome more than direct combat. For civilians trapped inside, life became a daily struggle for survival, while attackers faced their own hardships in the field. Victory in a siege could shift the balance of power in a region, making them a central strategy in medieval military campaigns. The role of women in medieval society was complex and varied greatly by class and location. Noble women managed estates in their husbands' absence, oversaw household staff, and arranged marriages to strengthen political alliances. They could be patrons of the arts, skilled in diplomacy, and occasionally even leaders in battle. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, tended animals, and managed domestic duties. Some women became artisans, midwives, or innkeepers, contributing to local economies. Religious life offered another path, with convents providing education, stability, and spiritual fulfillment. While legal rights for women were limited, widows often enjoyed more autonomy, managing property and business affairs. Literature and courtly tradition sometimes idealized women as symbols of beauty and virtue, though everyday reality was far more demanding. Despite the constraints of their time, women played essential roles in sustaining medieval communities and influencing the course of local and even national affairs. Art and architecture flourished during the medieval period, reflecting both religious devotion and the growing influence of trade and wealth. Gothic cathedrals soared above towns, their pointed arches, stained glass windows, and intricate stone carvings inspiring awe. These monumental projects could take generations to complete, involving skilled craftsmen from across Europe. Illuminated manuscripts, created by monks in scriptoria, preserved religious texts and added beauty through detailed illustrations. Tapestries adorned castle walls, telling stories of battles, hunts, and myths while providing insulation. Sculpture, metalwork, and painting often depicted biblical scenes, saints, and local legends, reinforcing shared cultural and spiritual values. Art served not only as decoration but as a form of communication in a largely illiterate society, teaching moral lessons and celebrating community identity. The legacy of medieval art and architecture continues to shape the landscapes and cultural heritage of Europe today. Music in the medieval era was a vital part of both sacred and secular life. In churches and cathedrals, choirs performed Gregorian chants, their flowing melodies designed to enhance worship and lift the spirit. Traveling minstrels, troubadours, and jongleurs brought music to castles, markets, and festivals, singing songs of love, heroism, and local events. Instruments, such as the lute, harp, recorder, and hurdy-gurdy, added rhythm and harmony to performances. Noble courts often maintained resident musicians, whose compositions reflected the refinement and prestige of their patrons. Music also played a role in work, with rhythmic songs helping laborers coordinate their efforts in the fields or workshops. Though much medieval music was passed down orally, some was recorded in notation, preserving melodies that still survive today. It was a universal form of expression, crossing boundaries of class and language, and weaving itself into the daily fabric of medieval life. Literature during the medieval period was diverse, ranging from epic poetry and religious texts to romances and moral tales. Works like Beowulf celebrated heroism and valor, while Arthurian legends captured the imagination with tales of knights, quests, and magical realms. Courtly love poetry explored themes of longing, honor, and idealized devotion, often written for noble audiences. Religious works, such as the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, or the moral plays performed in town squares, aimed to instruct and inspire. Storytelling was not limited to the written word. Oral traditions thrived, with bards and minstrels passing down legends and local histories through performance. The spread of literacy, though slow, gradually expanded audiences, and by the late medieval period, the advent of printing began to transform access to books. Literature served both as entertainment and as a means of preserving cultural memory across generations. Trade in the medieval world connected distant lands through networks of merchants, markets, and fairs. Spices from the east, furs from the north, and silks from Byzantium found their way into European markets, carried by ships and caravans. Towns near rivers or along trade routes flourished as hubs of exchange, attracting craftsmen, traders, and customers from miles around. Guilds played a central role in regulating commerce, setting standards for quality and price, and protecting their members' interests. Trade fairs were grand events, drawing merchants from across regions and fostering cultural exchange alongside economic activity. The expansion of trade contributed to the rise of a wealthy merchant class, whose influence began to rival that of the nobility. With trade came the spread of ideas, technologies, and even diseases, making it a powerful force in shaping medieval society's growth and challenges alike. Farming was the backbone of medieval life, providing the food and raw materials needed for survival. Most peasants worked long hours in the fields, using simple tools like wooden plows, sickles, and hoes. Oxen or horses were essential for pulling heavy equipment, and maintaining them was a constant priority. The agricultural year followed a strict rhythm, beginning with plowing and sowing in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in autumn, and repairing tools during winter. Fields were often organized in a 3-field rotation, allowing one section to rest each year to restore fertility. This system increased yields and reduced the risk of famine. Villages relied on communal cooperation, with shared grazing lands and coordinated planting schedules. Harvest time was especially demanding, with the whole community pitching in. Despite hard work, bad weather, pests, and disease could still destroy crops, leaving people vulnerable to hunger. Farming shaped daily life, community relationships, and economic stability. Medieval markets were vital to both urban and rural communities, serving as the main places for trade, news, and socializing. Weekly or seasonal markets brought together farmers, craftsmen, and merchants to exchange goods, ranging from fresh produce to imported luxuries. Villagers sold surplus crops, dairy, and handmade items, while townsfolk offered tools, cloth, and spices. Bargaining was expected, and market criers shouted prices and deals over the din of voices. These gatherings were also opportunities to hear traveling musicians, watch jugglers, or learn the latest political news. Markets were regulated by local authorities, who set fees for stalls and enforced rules to maintain order. They could also be dangerous places, with pickpockets and swindlers preying on the unsuspecting. For many people, market day was one of the few chances to interact with outsiders, buy rare goods, and escape the routine of daily labor. They were hubs of both commerce and culture. Medieval law relied heavily on local customs, oral traditions, and the authority of lords or magistrates. Justice was often public, with trials held in open spaces so the community could witness proceedings. Witnesses and oaths carried great weight, and punishments ranged from fines and public humiliation to imprisonment or execution. Trial by combat and trial by ordeal reflected the belief that divine intervention would reveal the truth. For lesser crimes, punishments such as the stocks or pillory served to shame offenders and deter others. More serious crimes could lead to mutilation or hanging. The church also played a role in legal matters, especially in cases involving morality or religious offenses. Clerics accused of crimes were often tried in ecclesiastical courts, which could be more lenient. While justice could be swift, it was not always fair, and those with wealth or influence often had an advantage in disputes. Law reinforced the existing social hierarchy. Weapons in the medieval period evolved alongside advances in armor and battlefield tactics. Swords were iconic, symbolizing status and martial skill, but they were expensive and often reserved for knights or wealthy soldiers. Spears and polearms were common among foot soldiers, offering reach and effectiveness against cavalry. Bows, particularly the English longbow, proved devastating in skilled hands, capable of piercing armor from a distance. Crossbows, though slower to reload, packed tremendous power and required less training. Siege weapons such as catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams were crucial in attacking fortified positions. Weapon making was a skilled trade, with blacksmiths forging blades, fitting hilts, and balancing each piece for performance. Maintenance was constant, as rust, wear, and damage were inevitable. Weapons were not only tools of war, but also symbols of authority, often displayed in great halls or carried during ceremonies to project power and prestige. Armor was the primary defense for soldiers and knights, developing from simple leather garments to complex suits of plate. Early medieval warriors relied on padded tunics, chainmail, and helmets for protection. Chainmail, made from thousands of interlinked rings, was flexible and durable but offered limited resistance against powerful crossbows or heavy weapons. By the late Middle Ages, full-plate armor became the standard for knights, crafted from shaped steel to cover the entire body while allowing movement. Helmets evolved from simple conical designs to vizard great helms, and later more articulated styles. Armor was costly, often passed down through families or modified for new owners. Maintenance was critical, as rust and dents could weaken its effectiveness. While armor offered excellent protection, it was heavy, requiring strength and stamina to wear in battle. Despite its weight, plate armor was surprisingly mobile, enabling skilled warriors to fight effectively on foot or horseback. Medieval medicine was deeply influenced by ancient theories, religious beliefs, and practical herbal knowledge. Physicians often followed the teachings of Galen, focusing on balancing the four humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and prescribed diets, along with herbal remedies made from plants like sage, rosemary, and garlic. Monasteries served as centers of medical care, with monks and nuns tending the sick, using both prayer and practical treatments. Midwives were vital in childbirth, bringing experience and local knowledge to their work. Surgery was risky and typically limited to superficial wounds or amputations, as infections were poorly understood. Plagues and epidemics posed constant threats, with the Black Death wiping out large portions of Europe's population. Public health was minimal, and sanitation in towns was poor, making disease spread rapidly. Despite limited understanding, medieval communities developed resilient health practices based on observation and tradition. The role of the church extended far beyond religion, influencing politics, education, and daily life. Monasteries and convents preserved ancient texts, provided schooling, and offered charity to the poor. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of the year, with holy days, fasts, and feast days shaping work and leisure. Tithes collected from parishioners funded church activities and construction projects, including the grand cathedrals that still stand today. Clergy often mediated disputes, acted as scribes for legal matters, and advised rulers. Pilgrimages to holy sites were acts of devotion and opportunities for travel, commerce, and cultural exchange. The church also exercised moral authority, enforcing doctrines and punishing heresy. Yet it was not free from corruption, with some clergy accumulating wealth and political influence. For ordinary people, the church offered spiritual guidance, a sense of community, and the hope of salvation, making it central to medieval identity and stability. Feasts in the medieval world were grand displays of wealth and hospitality, especially among the nobility. Long tables in great halls groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pies, bread, and exotic spices imported from distant lands. Entertainment was an integral part of these gatherings, with minstrels, jesters, and dancers performing between courses. Feasts marked important occasions such as weddings, victories, or religious celebrations, and they reinforced bonds between lords and their guests. Etiquette was important, with rules about seating, serving, and even the way food was carved. For the poor, feasts were rare opportunities to enjoy generous portions, often during public celebrations where surplus food might be distributed. Alcohol flowed freely, with ale, mead, and wine accompanying the meal. While feasts were moments of joy, they also served political purposes, allowing hosts to showcase their power, reward loyalty, and strengthen alliances within their social networks. The countryside was the defining landscape of medieval Europe, a patchwork of fields, forests, and small villages. Life moved at a slower pace compared to bustling towns, yet it was no less demanding. Farmers rose with the sun to tend crops and animals, while children fetched water, gathered firewood, or scared birds from the grain. Forests provided timber, game, and foraged foods, but were often subject to strict hunting rights controlled by local lords. Seasonal changes dictated daily routines, with long summer days filled with fieldwork and winter months devoted to repairs, weaving, and preserving food. Neighbors relied on each other for labor and protection, forming tight-knit communities bound by necessity. The natural world was both a resource and a challenge, offering sustenance but also dangers like floods, harsh winters, and wolves. Despite hardships, the countryside sustained the vast majority of the medieval population. Hunting was both a practical and recreational activity in the medieval period. For peasants, it provided supplementary food, though strict laws often restricted hunting rights to nobility. Poaching could lead to severe punishment, yet many risked it to feed their families. Nobles treated hunting as a sport, using it to train for war and display their wealth. They pursued deer, boar, and birds of prey, often with elaborate hunts involving hounds, falcons, and mounted riders. Falconry was especially prestigious, requiring skill, patience, and the training of birds like peregrine, falcons, or goshawks. Hunts were social events, followed by feasts where the game was served. Beyond providing food, hunting reinforced social hierarchies, with elaborate rules governing who could hunt what animals. It was as much about ceremony and status as it was about sustenance, symbolizing control over both land and nature. Guilds played a central role in shaping urban life, regulating trades and protecting the interests of craftsmen and merchants. Membership provided access to resources, training, and networks that ensured the quality and reputation of goods. Apprenticeship was the path into a guild, involving years of learning under a master before becoming a journeyman and eventually a master in one's own right. Guilds set prices, enforced standards, and cared for members in times of illness or hardship. They also contributed to civic life, sponsoring religious festivals, funding public works, and maintaining order in marketplaces. Rivalries between guilds could be fierce, especially when competing for lucrative contracts or trade routes. For townspeople, guilds offered stability and opportunity, creating a structured path for economic advancement. They were a powerful force in medieval society, balancing cooperation with competition in the pursuit of prosperity. Ships and seafaring expanded the horizons of the medieval world, connecting Europe to distant lands through trade and exploration. Coastal towns thrived on fishing, shipbuilding, and maritime commerce, with bustling harbors filled with cogs, caravels, and galleys. Merchants sailed to the Baltic for timber and furs, to the Mediterranean for spices and silks, and to the British Isles for wool and tin. Navigation relied on the stars, compasses, and coastal landmarks, making voyages risky in bad weather. Pirates and hostile fleets were constant threats, prompting the need for armed escorts. Sea travel was faster than overland routes for bulk goods, but storms and shipwrecks were common hazards. Ports became cultural melting pots, where languages, fashions, and ideas from across the known world mixed. Seafaring was both a lifeline for trade and a driver of change, shaping economies, politics, and cultural exchange throughout the medieval period. Medieval warfare was an ever-present reality, shaping the political and social landscape of the time. Conflicts ranged from small skirmishes between neighboring lords to large-scale campaigns involving entire kingdoms. Armies were composed of a mix of knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries, each playing a distinct role. Knights provided heavily armed cavalry, capable of devastating charges, while infantry held lines, defended positions, and engaged in melee combat. Archers supported from a distance, harassing enemies and disrupting formations. Campaigns were often seasonal, as winter made movement and supply difficult. War was costly, requiring taxes, supplies, and coordination, which strained both rulers and subjects. The devastation of war could cripple regions, destroying crops, displacing populations, and leaving lasting scars on communities. Yet for many nobles, war was also a means of gaining land, wealth, and prestige, reinforcing the cycle of conflict that defined much of medieval political life. Fortifications were critical in defending against the constant threat of attack. Beyond castles, towns often had stone walls, watchtowers, and fortified gates to deter raiders and invaders. Moats, drawbridges, and barbicans added layers of defense, while arrow slits and murder holes allowed defenders to attack safely from above. Building and maintaining these defenses required significant resources and labor, often provided by the local population under obligation to their lord. During times of siege, these fortifications could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Towns with strong defenses became centers of trade and governance, attracting settlers who valued security. However, the presence of walls did not guarantee safety, as determined attackers could still breach them through siege engines, tunneling, or prolonged blockades. The imposing sight of fortified walls served as both a deterrent and a symbol of stability, shaping the geography and power dynamics of medieval Europe. Religious orders played an influential role in both spiritual and secular affairs. Monks and nuns lived under strict rules, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and service. Orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and Franciscans emphasized different aspects of religious life. From scholarly preservation to poverty and preaching, monasteries often became economic hubs, owning land, running mills, and producing goods such as wine, cheese, and manuscripts. They provided hospitality to travelers, cared for the sick, and educated local children. Some orders, like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, combined monastic vows with military service, protecting pilgrims and defending Christian territories. Religious orders wielded significant influence, advising rulers, participating in diplomacy, and shaping cultural values. Their architectural achievements, such as cloisters and abbeys, remain as lasting testaments to their presence. While their spiritual mission was central, their wealth and power sometimes led to criticism, particularly during periods of church reform and political tension. The medieval diet reflected a deep divide between rich and poor. Nobles enjoyed a variety of meats, game, fish, and exotic spices, while peasants relied on bread, pottage, and seasonal vegetables. Dairy products such as cheese and butter were common, as were preserved foods like salted fish or smoked meats. Sweeteners came from honey, as sugar was a rare luxury. Drinking water was often unsafe in towns, leading people to consume ale or weak beer as a staple beverage, with wine more common in southern regions. Feasting was an opportunity to display wealth, with elaborate dishes and decorative presentations. Meals were served without the utensils we know today, relying on knives, spoons, and bread trenchers to hold food. Seasonal availability dictated variety, with winter diets relying heavily on stored goods. The contrast between noble banquets and peasant fare reflected broader social inequalities that defined medieval life. Education evolved significantly over the medieval period. Early on, most learning took place in monasteries, where monks copied manuscripts and taught Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. By the High Middle Ages, cathedral schools and universities emerged, offering more formal education to those who could afford it. The University of Bologna, Oxford, and Paris became renowned centers of learning, attracting students from across Europe. Studies focused on grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, often within a religious framework. Law, medicine, and theology were advanced fields, with degrees taking years to earn. While education remained limited to men of the upper classes, some women in noble or religious circles received instruction. Literacy slowly spread among merchants and artisans, driven by the demands of trade and record-keeping. The growth of education contributed to the exchange of ideas, the preservation of classical knowledge, and the intellectual shifts that would later shape the Renaissance. The plague was one of the most devastating events of the medieval period. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, killed millions and fundamentally altered society. Spread by fleas carried on rats, the disease moved rapidly along trade routes, decimating towns and villages. Symptoms included fever, swelling of lymph nodes, and dark blotches on the skin. Entire communities were wiped out, and the loss of laborers disrupted agriculture, trade, and daily life. Fear and uncertainty led to scapegoating, with some groups unfairly blamed for the outbreak. Religious processions, prayers, and penance became common responses, though they did little to halt the disease. In the aftermath, labor shortages empowered surviving peasants to demand better wages and conditions, weakening the rigid structures of feudalism. The psychological impact was profound, influencing art, literature, and religious thought for generations. The plague reshaped Europe in ways that endured long after the epidemic ended. Artisans brought skill and craftsmanship to every aspect of medieval life. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and armor, while carpenters built homes, furniture, and carts. Weavers and dyers produced cloth, often working in small workshops or from home. Potters shaped and fired vessels for cooking and storage, and masons carved stone for cathedrals and fortifications. These trades were often organized into guilds, which regulated quality, set prices, and trained apprentices. Artisans played a vital role in local economies, creating goods essential for daily living and luxury items for wealthier customers. Markets and fairs provided opportunities to sell their products, while large building projects employed teams of skilled laborers for years at a time. The artistry of medieval craftsmen is evident in surviving artifacts, from intricate metalwork to stained glass windows. Their work combined utility with beauty, reflecting both practical needs and the cultural values of their communities. Pilgrimages were central to medieval religious practice, drawing people from all walks of life to holy sites across Europe and beyond. Journeys could last weeks or months, taking pilgrims through unfamiliar lands and challenging conditions. Some sought physical healing, others spiritual renewal, and many undertook pilgrimages as acts of penance. Popular destinations included Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury Cathedral in England, and Rome. Pilgrims carried distinctive badges or tokens to mark their journeys, and their routes supported entire economies of inns, markets, and guides. Travel was often in groups for safety, as roads could be dangerous. Along the way, pilgrims experienced new cultures, languages, and landscapes, bringing back stories and souvenirs. Pilgrimage was both a personal and communal act, reinforcing the shared faith and identity of medieval Christendom, while fostering connections between distant regions. Heraldry developed as a system of identification for knights and noble families. Coats of arms, displayed on shields, banners, and surcoats, allowed warriors to be recognized in battle and tournaments. Each design followed strict rules, with specific colors, symbols, and patterns signifying lineage, alliances, and achievements. Heralds were experts in these codes, recording genealogies and officiating at tournaments. Over time, heraldry extended beyond the battlefield, appearing on seals, architecture, and household items as a mark of prestige. Families guarded their heraldic designs carefully, and disputes over usage could arise. The visual language of heraldry became an enduring aspect of medieval culture, linking generations and reinforcing the importance of heritage. Today, many coats of arms survive as historical records, offering insight into the social networks and personal identities of the medieval elite. Forests were vital resources in the medieval world, providing timber for building, fuel for fires, and game for hunting. They were also sources of wild fruits, nuts, herbs, and medicinal plants. However, access to forests was often restricted by law, with hunting rights reserved for nobility. Forest law protected valuable game animals like deer and boar, and poaching was severely punished. Royal forests were extensive, sometimes encompassing entire villages within their boundaries, and their management was an important aspect of royal authority. For commoners, the forest could be both a source of livelihood and a place of danger, harboring wolves and bandits. Folklore and legends often centered on forests, portraying them as mysterious realms of both opportunity and peril. The balance between use and conservation of forests reflected broader tensions between the needs of the population and the privileges of the elite. Mining played a significant role in the medieval economy, supplying metals for tools, weapons, coins, and construction. Iron was the most essential, used for plows, nails, and armor, while silver and gold fueled currency and luxury goods. Mining was labor-intensive and dangerous, with miners working in dark, cramped tunnels prone to collapse and flooding. Techniques included fire setting to crack rock, hand tools for extraction, and water-powered machinery for processing. Or mines were often controlled by lords or monarchs, who profited from the resources extracted. Entire communities grew around mining operations, with specialized skills passed down through generations. The wealth generated by mining supported local economies, funded military campaigns, and contributed to the growth of trade networks. Despite the hazards, mining remained a vital industry throughout the medieval period, shaping both regional development and the fortunes of those who controlled it. Medieval trade routes tied distant parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia together in an interconnected web of goods, ideas, and cultures. Overland caravans transported spices, silk, and precious stones from the east, while ships carried wool, wine, and salt between coastal ports. The Hanseatic League dominated northern trade in the Baltic and North Seas, while Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa controlled Mediterranean commerce. Merchants braved harsh weather, piracy, and banditry to deliver goods to markets and fairs. Trade created thriving port cities, spurred shipbuilding, and led to innovations in navigation. The flow of goods also meant the spread of knowledge, technology, and even diseases. Trade was not only about material wealth, it shaped politics, forged alliances, and influenced cultural trends. The fabrics worn, spices tasted, and tools used in daily medieval life often had origins thousands of miles away, carried by determined traders along these routes. Medieval villages were self-sufficient communities, producing most of what they needed for daily life. Fields surrounded clusters of houses, with gardens, orchards, and pastures providing food and resources. Villages shared communal lands for grazing animals, cutting timber, and gathering wild plants. Seasonal work brought people together for planting, harvesting, and maintaining infrastructure like roads or mills. Local craftsmen repaired tools, made clothing, and built homes, while barter systems supplemented the limited use of coins. The manors lord oversaw agricultural production, collected rents, and resolved disputes, often through a steward. Villages were bound by tradition, with customs regulating everything from land inheritance to marriage arrangements. Social life revolved around the church, market days, and seasonal festivals. Though isolated compared to towns, villages were deeply connected to the rhythms of nature and community cooperation. Life was hard, but these small settlements formed the backbone of medieval society, sustaining populations across vast territories. Medieval justice often relied on community involvement. Disputes were sometimes settled through public assemblies, where respected elders or appointed officials heard arguments from both sides. Sworn oaths and character witnesses could carry as much weight as physical evidence. When a crime was serious, punishment served both to penalize the offender and deter others. Public executions, floggings, or time in the stocks were meant to be seen by all, reinforcing authority. Minor disputes could be resolved through compensation, barter, or negotiated settlements. The church also had its own legal system, dealing with issues of morality, clerical misconduct, and matters involving sacred spaces. Because travel was limited, justice was often localized, and different regions had their own customs. Though laws could be harsh, the close-knit nature of communities meant that reconciliation was sometimes preferred over prolonged conflict, especially when both parties needed to work together in daily life after the matter was resolved. Architecture in the medieval period reflected both practical needs and artistic ambitions. Romanesque buildings, with their thick walls, rounded arches, and small windows, dominated the early centuries. Later, the Gothic style emerged, characterized by pointed arches, flying buttresses, and expansive stained-glass windows that filled interiors with light. Cathedrals became the pride of towns, often taking decades or centuries to complete. Castles were built for defense, but even they incorporated decorative elements to display wealth and status. In towns, half-timbered houses lined narrow streets, their upper floors sometimes jutting out above the road. Building materials varied by region, with stone favored in some areas and timber in others. Skilled masons, carpenters, and glazers were in high demand, their work shaping the skyline. These structures were more than functional, they were symbols of identity, power, and faith, reflecting the values and ambitions of the people who built and used them. The medieval economy depended heavily on agriculture, but specialized trades added diversity and resilience. Mills powered by water or wind processed grain into flour, enabling more efficient food production. Tanneries prepared hides for clothing, armor, and tools, though their strong odors often placed them on the outskirts of towns. Breweries produced ale, a staple drink, while bakeries supplied bread for both rich and poor. In larger towns, Luxury trades like goldsmithing, glassmaking, and fine cloth production catered to wealthy clients. These industries created jobs, encouraged skill development, and fostered trade. Many of these operations were overseen by guilds, ensuring quality and fair prices. The growth of specialized trades allowed towns to thrive independently of rural cycles, creating pockets of prosperity that could withstand poor harvests. Over time, these industries became vital to the identity of towns, with reputations for certain goods spreading far beyond their immediate region. The role of music in medieval life spanned every social class and occasion. Religious music, particularly Gregorian chant, filled churches and monasteries, creating an atmosphere of reverence and spiritual focus. Secular music thrived in courts and public spaces, performed by troubadours, minstrels, and itinerant musicians. Instruments like the lute, viol, bagpipes, and drums accompanied dances, feasts, and festivals. Songs told stories of romance, heroism, and history, often blending entertainment with moral lessons. Music marked important life events, such as weddings, coronations, and seasonal celebrations. In towns, guilds of musicians regulated performance standards, and in rural villages, music was part of communal gatherings around the hearth. The blending of oral tradition and written composition preserved some works for posterity, while countless others evolved over generations. Music's universality made it a bridge across class divisions, binding communities together in shared rhythms and melodies that echoed throughout medieval society. Medieval science was deeply influenced by classical knowledge, religious doctrine, and practical observation. Scholars studied the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, often filtered through translations from the Islamic world. Medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy were central areas of inquiry, with universities teaching a blend of theoretical and applied subjects. Astrology was intertwined with astronomy, influencing decisions from planting crops to diagnosing illnesses. Alchemy sought to transform base metals into gold and discover the elixir of life, blending experimentation with mysticism. Agricultural science advanced through crop rotation techniques and innovations in water management. The Church both supported and limited scientific study, encouraging research that aligned with religious beliefs while opposing ideas seen as heretical. Despite restrictions, medieval science laid foundations for later developments, preserving and expanding knowledge through careful record-keeping, translation, and experimentation that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance. Medieval transportation was slow by modern standards, shaped by the limitations of roads, vehicles, and animals. Most travel was on foot, with pack animals carrying goods over long distances. Wealthier travelers rode horses, while carts and wagons were drawn by oxen or mules. Roads could be muddy, rutted, or impassable in bad weather, and bridges were rare, making river crossings dangerous. River and sea transport offered faster alternatives for heavy cargo, with barges and ships moving goods between towns and ports. Ferries provided essential links across waterways, though they were vulnerable to storms and accidents. Travel was often seasonal, with winter journeys avoided unless absolutely necessary. Inns and monasteries provided shelter along popular routes, but accommodations could be crowded and uncomfortable. The challenges of transportation shaped trade patterns, settlement locations, and the flow of information, making mobility both a vital necessity and a calculated risk in medieval life. Daily hygiene in the medieval period was modest by modern expectations, but still valued within cultural norms. People washed their hands and faces regularly, and bathing was more common than often assumed, especially in towns with public bathhouses. These establishments provided warm water and sometimes massages, though they also carried reputations as places of vice. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, while perfumes and herbs helped mask unpleasant odors. Laundry was done by soaking clothes in lye or ash water and beating them clean in streams. In rural areas, bathing was less frequent, often tied to seasonal availability of water. Dentistry was basic, with tooth extraction being the most common treatment for pain. While disease still spread easily due to limited sanitation infrastructure, personal grooming habits reflected a concern for cleanliness, health, and social presentation within the constraints of the era's resources. Monastic libraries were treasure houses of knowledge in the medieval world. Monks and nuns copied manuscripts by hand, preserving religious texts, classical works, and local records. The process was painstaking, requiring careful attention to lettering, illumination, and binding. Scribes used parchment made from animal skins, and inks mixed from natural materials like oak galls and soot. Illuminations added vibrant illustrations and decorative borders, turning some manuscripts into masterpieces of art. Libraries were usually restricted to members of the religious community, though scholars and travelers could sometimes gain access with permission. Catalogs organized the collections, and borrowing was rare to prevent loss. These libraries safeguarded much of the knowledge that might have been lost during times of political upheaval and war. By preserving ancient writings and producing new ones, monastic scriptoria ensured the survival of intellectual traditions that would later influence Europe's cultural and scientific revival. Medieval markets were not only places of trade but vibrant centers of social life. Stalls overflowed with produce, cloth, pottery, and tools, while the air buzzed with bargaining and conversation. Merchants from faraway lands brought exotic goods, and local farmers sold seasonal harvests. Street performers entertained passers-by with music, juggling, or storytelling, creating an atmosphere of constant movement and noise. Markets were also venues for spreading news, as town criers delivered official announcements. Regulations kept prices fair and ensured weights and measures were honest, though disputes were common. Market days could attract people from miles around, offering opportunities for courtship, gossip, and alliance building. For many rural families, market day was a rare chance to see goods and faces from beyond their village. It was a blend of commerce, entertainment, and community connection, a reminder that even in an age of limited travel, people were part of a wider network of exchange. Medieval gardens were essential for both sustenance and pleasure. In rural areas, cottage gardens supplied vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants. Herbs like rosemary, sage, and parsley flavored meals and treated ailments, while flowers like marigolds and roses had both decorative and practical uses. Wealthy estates featured elaborate ornamental gardens, designed with symmetry and filled with fountains, sculptures, and rare plants. Monastic gardens combined beauty with function, cultivating plants for cooking, healing, and dye-making. Garden work followed the seasons, with planting in spring, maintenance in summer, and harvesting in autumn. Tools were simple but effective, and knowledge of soil and weather was passed down through generations. Gardens were not just sources of food, but also spaces for relaxation, prayer, and social interaction. The scent of flowers, the hum of bees, and the satisfaction of tending the earth made gardens a cherished part of medieval life across all classes. Medieval towns often had a distinctive rhythm shaped by work, worship, and trade. Mornings began with the opening of shop shutters and the ringing of church bells. Artisans labored in workshops, their tools clinking and scraping, while apprentices ran errands through narrow, crowded streets. The scent of bread from bakeries mingled with smoke from hearths and the less pleasant smells of refuse and livestock. Midday saw markets at their busiest, with goods changing hands and travelers arriving from nearby villages. In the afternoons, guild meetings, religious services, or social gatherings filled the hours. As night fell, gates were often closed for security, and watchmen patrolled the streets. Candles and oil lamps lit homes, while taverns offered food, drink, and music. Life in a town was busier and more crowded than in the countryside, but it offered greater opportunities for commerce, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange, drawing people from rural areas in search of prosperity. Medieval festivals were lively events blending religious devotion with communal joy. Feast days honored saints or marked significant points in the church calendar, often accompanied by processions, music, and dramatic performances. Villages and towns transformed into hubs of activity, with games, dancing, and contests drawing people from surrounding areas. Food stalls offered treats rarely eaten during ordinary days, and ale flowed freely. These celebrations allowed people to momentarily escape the hardships of daily labor, fostering bonds between neighbors. Nobles sometimes hosted tournaments alongside festivals, adding pageantry and martial spectacle to the occasion. Seasonal festivals, such as harvest celebrations, were rooted in ancient traditions, blending Christian observances with older folk customs. For the poor, festivals could be one of the few times to enjoy abundant food and drink, while for the wealthy, they were opportunities to display generosity and reinforce social ties. They were essential in uniting communities and preserving shared traditions. Medieval weapon training was a lifelong practice for those expected to fight. Knights and soldiers drilled regularly with swords, spears, and bows, honing both individual skill and coordinated tactics. Wooden wasters or blunted weapons were used for practice to reduce injury, though accidents still occurred. Archery practice was encouraged by law in some regions, with village greens serving as training grounds. Combat training was not limited to men. In certain circumstances, women of noble households learned to handle weapons for defense. Training was often accompanied by physical conditioning, running, climbing, and wrestling to build strength and endurance. Skills were tested in tournaments, mock battles, and hunting expeditions. For professional soldiers and mercenaries, training never ceased, as proficiency meant survival in battle. The emphasis on discipline, precision, and readiness ensured that medieval armies could respond quickly to threats, whether defending a castle or marching to war in a distant land. Medieval bridges were vital links in transportation and trade networks. Often built from stone for durability, they spanned rivers that would otherwise be dangerous or impassable in bad weather. Wooden bridges were cheaper and quicker to build, but required regular repairs. Many stone bridges were engineering feats, with graceful arches that distributed weight efficiently. Bridges were sometimes funded by tolls or donations, and religious orders occasionally maintained them as acts of charity. They were not just practical structures but also social and economic hubs, with markets or fairs held nearby. Control over a major bridge could be politically significant, allowing lords to tax traffic and monitor movement. Some bridges incorporated chapels, where travelers could stop to pray for safe passage. These enduring constructions connected communities, facilitated commerce, and symbolized the cooperation and ingenuity of medieval builders, who combined functionality with beauty. Medieval fairs were larger and more elaborate than regular markets, often lasting several days or even weeks. They drew merchants from far-off regions, offering goods like fine cloth, spices, jewelry, and exotic animals. The atmosphere was festive, with music, dancing, and theatrical performances alongside commercial transactions. Nobles sometimes attended, both to purchase luxury items and to display their wealth and influence. Fairs were also opportunities for political negotiations, marriage arrangements, and the exchange of news. Special laws and protections were enacted to ensure the safety of traders and visitors, encouraging wide participation. The influx of visitors stimulated local economies, with inns, taverns, and craftsmen benefiting from increased demand. For many, attending a fair was a rare and exciting experience, exposing them to products and cultures far beyond their own. Fairs were essential in connecting isolated communities to the broader economic and cultural world of the medieval period. Medieval clothing reflected both social status and practical needs. Peasants wore simple tunics, hose, and cloaks made from coarse wool or linen, dyed in natural muted colors. Clothing was designed for durability, with garments patched and repurposed as needed. Wealthier individuals wore finer fabrics like silk and velvet, often imported at great cost. Bright colors and elaborate embroidery displayed wealth, as dyes like deep blue and crimson were expensive. Sumptuary laws regulated what different classes could wear, reinforcing visible distinctions between social ranks. Accessories such as belts, brooches, and hats completed outfits, while fur linings added warmth in winter. Footwear ranged from simple leather shoes to elaborately decorated boots. Clothing was not only functional but also a means of expressing identity, profession, and allegiance. The difference between a farmer's work-worn tunic and a noble's ornate gown was a daily reminder of the rigid class structure of medieval society. Medieval roads were a mix of ancient Roman routes, dirt tracks, and locally maintained paths that varied greatly in quality. In good weather, they allowed steady travel between towns and villages, but in rain or snow they could become muddy quagmires. Many roads were little more than widened footpaths, marked by stones or natural landmarks rather than formal signage. Maintenance was often the responsibility of local lords or communities, though repairs were sporadic. Roman-built stone roads, still in use, offered the best travel conditions, though their network had long since deteriorated. Bridges, ferries, and fords linked segments of the network, but travelers often had to detour for safe crossings. Roads were essential for trade, military movement, and communication, and their condition could affect the prosperity of entire regions. Despite their flaws, they connected the medieval world, carrying everything from merchants' wagons to royal processions along their uneven, unpredictable paths. Medieval ships were diverse in design and purpose, reflecting the varied needs of merchants, fishermen, and naval powers. Cogs were sturdy cargo ships common in northern Europe, with high sides and a single square sail for stability in rough seas. In the Mediterranean, galleys powered by oars and sails were favored for speed and maneuverability. Fishing boats of all sizes dotted coastlines, supplying local markets with fresh catches. Shipbuilding was a highly skilled trade, requiring expertise in wood selection, hull shaping, and waterproofing with tar or pitch. Ports bustled with activity, from loading goods to repairing vessels between voyages. Naval warfare depended heavily on ships, with boarding actions and missile fire replacing modern artillery. Mariners relied on coastal landmarks, stars, and rudimentary charts for navigation, making each journey a blend of skill, endurance, and luck. Ships linked distant ports, enabling the trade networks and cultural exchanges that shaped medieval life. Medieval inns offered essential shelter and food for travelers, though conditions varied widely. In small villages, an inn might be a single-room establishment with straw beds, shared by strangers. Larger towns boasted more comfortable lodgings, with private chambers for wealthy guests. Meals were simple, often consisting of bread, cheese, ale, and a stew prepared from whatever ingredients were available. Inns were lively social spaces where merchants exchanged news, travelers traded stories, and locals gathered for a drink. Prices could be negotiated, and travelers might pay in goods rather than coin. While inns provided welcome rest, they could also be noisy, crowded, and occasionally unsafe. For pilgrims, monasteries sometimes offered free lodging, though these spaces prioritized spiritual duties over comfort. Despite their limitations, inns were vital waypoints in a world where travel was slow and unpredictable, offering warmth, shelter, and human connection on long and often arduous journeys. Medieval hunting was more than a way to obtain food. It was a sport, a symbol of status, and a means of enforcing social hierarchy. Nobles hunted deer, boar, and game birds, often accompanied by hounds, falcons, and elaborate retinues. Laws strictly regulated hunting rights, reserving prime game for the elite and punishing poachers harshly. Hunts were carefully orchestrated events, with riders, beaters, and dogs working in coordination to drive animals toward waiting hunters. Falconry was an especially prestigious pursuit, requiring skill in training and handling birds of prey. Beyond sport, hunting served as military training, sharpening riding, tracking, and weapon skills. The meat, hides, and trophies from hunts were used in feasts and as gifts. For peasants, hunting smaller game or trapping animals supplemented their diet, though these activities were often restricted to avoid infringing on noble privileges. Hunting reflected the balance between necessity, tradition, and the display of power. Medieval siege warfare was a test of patience, resources, and engineering skill. Armies encircled a castle or fortified town, cutting off supplies in an attempt to starve defenders into surrender. Siege engines like trebuchets hurled stones, fire, or even diseased carcasses over walls, while battering rams targeted gates. Defenders responded with arrows, boiling oil, or counter-siege weapons. Siege towers, covered with wet hides to resist fire, allowed attackers to scale walls, while mining operations attempted to collapse fortifications from below. Sieges could last weeks, months, or even years, with disease and hunger often deciding the outcome more than direct combat. For civilians trapped inside, conditions grew desperate, and for attackers, maintaining an army in the field was costly and dangerous. The psychological strain on both sides was immense, making sieges as much about endurance as about military strength. Victory often reshaped the balance of power in the surrounding region. Medieval coinage reflected both economic needs and political authority. Coins were minted from precious metals like silver and gold, with designs bearing the image of the ruler or symbolic motifs. Each region or kingdom had its own currency, and merchants often had to exchange coins when traveling. The weight and purity of coins were carefully regulated, though counterfeiting was an ongoing problem. Smaller denominations made everyday transactions possible, while large coins facilitated trade in valuable goods. The control of minting was a sign of sovereignty, and rulers used coins as a means of spreading their image and reinforcing their legitimacy. In rural areas, barter remained common, but in towns and markets, coinage was essential for commerce. The flow of coins through trade, taxation, and wages linked people across distances, creating a monetary system that, while less standardized than today, still bound the medieval economy together. Medieval law enforcement was a patchwork of local customs, lordly authority, and church jurisdiction. In villages, communities often relied on mutual responsibility, with neighbors keeping watch over each other's property. Towns employed watchmen to patrol streets at night, while sheriffs or bailiffs oversaw law enforcement in larger areas. Trials could be held in manorial courts, royal courts, or ecclesiastical courts, depending on the crime. Punishments ranged from fines to public shaming, corporal punishment, or execution. For serious offenses, trial by ordeal such as carrying hot iron was sometimes used, with the outcome believed to reveal divine judgment. In many areas, there was no standing police force, and enforcement depended heavily on community participation. The church played a major role in moral cases, while secular courts handled property disputes and violence. Law enforcement aimed as much at maintaining social order as at administering justice, reinforcing the hierarchy of medieval society. Medieval feasts were grand spectacles, especially in noble courts. Long tables groaned under roasted meats, pastries, fruits, and spiced wine. Courses were served in stages, with musicians, jesters, and storytellers entertaining guests between dishes. Seating arrangements reflected social rank, with the most honored guests placed closest to the host. Table manners were governed by strict etiquette, and servants moved discreetly to refill cups and replace trenchers. Exotic spices like cinnamon and cloves signaled wealth, as they were imported from distant lands at great cost. Feasts often marked important occasions, marriages, victories, or religious festivals, and served as opportunities to display power and generosity. For the poor, feasts were rare, usually tied to public celebrations or charity from wealthy patrons. Beyond the food and entertainment, feasts reinforced alliances, showcased prestige, and provided a sense of shared identity among those fortunate enough to attend such lavish gatherings. Medieval farming was the lifeblood of most communities, with the vast majority of the population working the land. Fields were often divided into strips, managed by different families, ensuring that resources and harvests were shared. The three-field system allowed one section to rest each year, improving soil fertility and reducing the risk of crop failure. Plowing was done with heavy wooden plows tipped with iron, drawn by oxen or horses. Seasonal tasks dictated daily life, from planting in spring to harvesting in autumn and repairing tools during winter. Weather was a constant concern, as a bad season could lead to hunger or famine. In addition to crops like wheat, barley, and oats, peasants grew vegetables and kept livestock for milk, eggs, and meat. Farming required cooperation among neighbors, as shared labor made the demanding work more manageable. The agricultural cycle was unrelenting, but it sustained the medieval world's economic and social structure. Medieval mills revolutionized food production and local economies. Watermills and windmills ground grain into flour far more efficiently than manual labor, allowing bakers to produce bread in larger quantities. Mills also powered saws, hammers, and other machinery, enabling a variety of industries to thrive. The lord of the manor typically owned the mill, and peasants paid to use it, often in grain rather than coin. Millers held an important, if sometimes mistrusted, role in communities, as disputes over fees or fairness were common. The rhythmic turning of millstones became a familiar sound in villages, a reminder of the constant demand for bread. Building and maintaining mills required specialized skills, and their placement often depended on natural resources like rivers or windy hills. Beyond their practical use, mills symbolized progress and stability, anchoring communities to reliable sources of food and mechanical power in a time when manual labor dominated nearly every aspect of life. Medieval crafts were essential to everyday survival and comfort. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and household items, while carpenters built furniture, wagons, and homes. Weavers and dyers produced fabrics, often working within guild systems that regulated quality and prices. Leather workers created shoes, belts, and armor, while potters made durable vessels for cooking and storage. Each trade required years of apprenticeship under a master, with skills passed down from generation to generation. Craftsmen often lived and worked in the same building, their shops opening onto busy streets or market squares. Decorative arts, such as illuminated manuscripts or intricate metalwork, showcased both skill and creativity, blending utility with beauty. Craftsmanship shaped the character of towns and villages, with certain areas becoming known for specific goods. These trades not only met local needs but also contributed to trade networks, supplying markets and fairs with goods that reflected the ingenuity and labor of medieval artisans. Medieval churches were not just places of worship but central pillars of community life. They hosted religious services, marked life events such as baptisms, marriages, and funerals, and served as gathering places for villagers. The church calendar shaped the rhythm of the year, with feast days, saints' days, and holy seasons influencing work and leisure. Inside, the architecture reflected devotion and artistry, with stained-glass windows telling biblical stories for an often illiterate congregation. Bells called the faithful to prayer and signaled important events or dangers. Clergy provided spiritual guidance, mediated disputes, and sometimes taught reading and writing. Wealthy patrons funded elaborate altars, paintings, and sculptures, using their donations as both acts of piety and displays of status. Beyond its religious role, the church functioned as a hub for charity, distributing alms to the poor and caring for the sick. It was a constant presence, grounding the community through both faith and tradition. Medieval education was shaped by the church but expanded over time to include new centers of learning. Monasteries preserved classical knowledge by copying manuscripts and teaching Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. Cathedral schools prepared students for careers in the clergy or administration. By the 12th century, universities began to emerge in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, offering advanced studies in law, medicine, and philosophy. Students traveled long distances to attend, often enduring cramped living conditions and strict rules. Lessons were delivered through lectures, with heavy emphasis on memorization and debate. Books were rare and valuable. So much of learning relied on listening and note-taking. While education was largely reserved for men of higher status, some women in religious orders received scholarly training. Over time, literacy spread to merchants and artisans, driven by the demands of trade and record-keeping. This gradual expansion of education laid the groundwork for future intellectual revolutions. Medieval medicine blended ancient theories, local traditions, and religious beliefs. Physicians often relied on the writings of Galen and Hippocrates, diagnosing illnesses through the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, and changes in diet. Monastic infirmaries provided care using both prayer and practical methods, cultivating medicinal plants in their gardens. Midwives handled childbirth, offering both experience and community trust. Surgery was limited, with barber surgeons performing amputations, tooth extractions, and wound care. Diseases such as leprosy, smallpox, and the plague were poorly understood, leading to widespread fear during outbreaks. Sanitation was limited, and urban areas were especially vulnerable to epidemics. Despite these challenges, medieval medicine evolved through observation and exchange of knowledge with the Islamic world, where medical science was more advanced. While far from modern standards, it reflected a growing effort to understand and heal the human body. Medieval festivals brought life and color to towns and villages, marking religious and seasonal events. Feast days celebrated saints or significant moments in the church calendar, often with processions, plays, and music. Harvest festivals honored the gathering of crops, blending Christian and older pagan traditions. Markets expanded during these times, with traders selling goods from near and far. Food and drink were more plentiful, and games like archery contests or wrestling matches drew eager participants. For peasants, festivals provided a welcome break from labor and a chance to enjoy treats like roasted meats or spiced pastries. Nobles hosted tournaments alongside festivals, turning them into displays of wealth and martial skill. These gatherings strengthened community bonds, allowed for courtship, and preserved cultural traditions. Even in difficult years, festivals offered moments of joy, reminding people of the cycles of life and the shared experiences that united them. Medieval towns were bustling hubs of activity, often surrounded by defensive walls and marked by a central marketplace. Narrow, winding streets were lined with timber-framed houses, their upper stories jutting out over the road. Craftsmen worked in open front shops, displaying their goods to passers-by, while the clatter of carts and the calls of street vendors filled the air. The market square was the heart of town life, where merchants sold everything from fresh produce to imported spices and textiles. Townspeople lived in close quarters, with noise and smells a constant part of daily existence. Public wells provided water, though sanitation was limited, and waste disposal was a persistent problem. Guilds regulated trade and protected members' interests, giving towns a degree of economic stability. Despite the risks of fire, disease, and overcrowding, towns offered opportunities for prosperity and social advancement, attracting people from rural areas in search of work and better living conditions. Medieval warfare required more than just soldiers. It depended on logistics, planning, and supply lines. Armies needed food, weapons, armor, and horses, all of which had to be transported over long distances. Blacksmiths and armorers traveled with troops to make repairs, while cooks and servants prepared meals from whatever could be gathered or requisitioned. Camps were set up with careful attention to defense, often using wagons as barricades. Discipline was essential, as disorder could quickly lead to defeat. Soldiers faced long marches, harsh weather, and the constant threat of ambush. War was expensive, and funding campaigns often meant raising taxes or securing loans from wealthy merchants. The success of a military operation could hinge on securing adequate provisions and maintaining morale as much as on battlefield strategy. These practical challenges made warfare a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and leadership, shaping the political and territorial outcomes of medieval Europe. Medieval religion permeated every aspect of life, from the rhythms of the day to the structure of the year. Bells from the local church signaled times for prayer, work, and rest. The liturgical calendar marked important seasons such as Lent, Easter, and Christmas, as well as feast days honoring saints. Religious rituals accompanied major life events, offering both spiritual comfort and social recognition. The church provided moral guidance, education, and charity, reinforcing its authority through sermons and ceremonies. Pilgrimages were acts of devotion that also served as opportunities for travel and cultural exchange. Religious art and architecture reflected the community's faith, with stained glass, frescoes, and sculptures illustrating biblical stories for those unable to read. While the church was a unifying force, it also wielded significant political and economic power, influencing rulers and shaping laws. Faith was both a personal commitment and a collective identity, central to the medieval worldview. Medieval food reflected the seasons and the resources available locally. Bread was a staple for all classes, but while nobles enjoyed fine white loaves made from wheat, peasants ate coarse bread from barley or rye. Pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat, was a common dish. Meat was more frequent on noble tables, including venison, pork, and game birds, often flavored with expensive spices like pepper and cinnamon. Fish was important, especially on religious fasting days, with freshwater catches supplemented by salted or smoked varieties. Dairy products like cheese and butter were everyday fare for peasants, while nobles enjoyed richer cream-based dishes. Preservation methods, salting, smoking, and drying were essential for surviving winter. Meals were often eaten from trenchers of bread or wooden bowls, with knives and spoons as the main utensils. Food was not just sustenance but a marker of status, with diet reflecting the deep social divisions of medieval society. Medieval clothing varied widely between classes and regions, but always reflected function, status, and available materials. Peasants wore simple tunics, hose and cloaks made from coarse wool or linen, dyed in muted natural tones. These garments were durable, often patched and reused for years. Wealthier individuals wore fabrics like silk, velvet, and fine linen, dyed in bright colors that indicated wealth and status. Embroidery, fur trims, and jeweled accessories further distinguished the elite. Sumptuary laws restricted certain fabrics and colors to specific ranks, ensuring visual separation between classes. Footwear ranged from simple leather shoes to ornate boots. Seasonal changes required layering, with woolen cloaks in winter and lighter linen garments in summer. Hats and hoods served both practical and decorative purposes. Clothing was a form of identity, signaling a person's trade, wealth, and place in the social hierarchy, and it played a key role in the visual culture of medieval Europe. Medieval castles were both fortresses and symbols of power. Constructed primarily from stone, they featured thick walls, towers, and defensive structures like moats and drawbridges. Inside, a great hall served as the center of political and social life, hosting feasts, court sessions, and gatherings. Living quarters ranged from modest rooms for servants to richly furnished chambers for the lord and his family. Kitchens were large, designed to feed both residents and guests, while storerooms held supplies for times of siege. Chapels provided space for worship, reinforcing the role of religion within noble households. Castles were strategic centers, overseeing surrounding lands and protecting trade routes. They were also visible assertions of authority, their imposing silhouettes dominating the landscape. Over time, some castles became more comfortable, incorporating gardens, decorative stonework, and improved living spaces. but their primary purpose as defensive strongholds remained central throughout the medieval period. Medieval guilds regulated trades and professions, ensuring quality control, fair pricing, and mutual support among members. They were powerful organizations, often influencing town politics and economics. Apprenticeships provided young people with training in a specific craft, moving from apprentice to journeyman before achieving the rank of master. Guilds maintained strict standards, inspecting goods and resolving disputes between members. They also played a social role, organizing religious festivals, sponsoring charitable works, and supporting members during illness or hardship. Membership offered security and prestige, but also demanded loyalty and adherence to guild rules. Rivalries between guilds could be intense, especially in competitive markets. The guild system helped preserve specialized skills and fostered economic stability in towns, though it could also limit innovation by restricting entry to established families or connections. Guilds were vital to the organization of urban life and the prosperity of medieval communities. Medieval roads connected villages, towns, and cities, but their condition varied widely. In rural areas, they were often little more than dirt tracks, becoming muddy and impassable during bad weather. Roman-built stone roads, where they survived, provided the best routes, but maintenance was inconsistent. Local lords, monasteries, or communities were responsible for repairs, and tolls were sometimes charged to fund upkeep. Bridges were crucial for crossing rivers, but many were simple wooden structures prone to damage. Travel was slow, with foot and horseback being the primary means of transportation for most people. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers formed a constant trickle of movement along these routes, bringing news and goods between regions. Roads were also vital for military campaigns, allowing armies to move equipment and supplies. Despite their challenges, medieval roads were lifelines of communication and trade, shaping the economic and cultural landscape of the period. Medieval agriculture relied heavily on cooperation among villagers. The open field system divided farmland into large strips, with each family cultivating several scattered plots. This arrangement helped share risk, as different soils and microclimates could produce varied yields. Work was coordinated by the agricultural calendar, with communal plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Tools were basic wooden plows tipped with iron, sickles for cutting grain, and flails for threshing. Livestock such as oxen, sheep, and chickens were essential for food and labor, grazing on common pastures. Manure fertilized fields, though yields remained low by modern standards. Weather was the most unpredictable factor, and a single poor season could bring hunger to an entire village. Peasants owed part of their crops to their lord as rent or feudal dues, leaving them with just enough to survive. Despite these hardships, the system sustained Europe's growing population for centuries, embedding farming into every aspect of rural life. Medieval water management was vital for survival and prosperity. Villages and towns relied on rivers, wells, and rainwater collection for drinking, cooking, and irrigation. Mills, powered by flowing water, processed grain or operated machinery for industries like clothmaking. In some regions, elaborate systems of ditches and channels irrigated fields or drained marshlands, expanding arable land. Access to clean water was a constant challenge, especially in densely populated towns where contamination from waste was common. Monasteries often led the way in building aqueducts and reservoirs to supply both the religious community and local residents. Wells were central gathering points, and their maintenance was essential. In coastal and riverine areas, water transport was as important as roads for moving goods. The ability to harness and control water resources influenced settlement patterns, agricultural productivity, and public health, making it one of the most important aspects of medieval infrastructure. Medieval markets were organized events that brought together producers, traders, and consumers. Weekly markets served local needs, while larger seasonal fairs attracted merchants from distant regions. Goods ranged from fresh vegetables and dairy products to imported spices, fine cloth, and tools. Market regulations ensured fair weights and measures, with appointed officials inspecting goods and resolving disputes. Prices fluctuated with supply, demand, and seasonal changes. Markets also served as centers of news and social interaction where travelers shared stories and townsfolk discussed local events. They were noisy, colorful places, filled with the scent of cooking food and the shouts of vendors. Entertainment such as jugglers, musicians, and street performers added to the lively atmosphere. For rural families, Market day was one of the few opportunities to access goods not produced locally, making it a cornerstone of both the economy and community life in medieval society. Medieval warfare was as much about strategy as brute force. Campaigns were planned around seasons, avoiding the difficulties of winter travel and supply. Armies were composed of a mix of knights, infantry, and archers, supported by craftsmen, cooks, and camp followers. Commanders used terrain to their advantage, seeking high ground or defensible positions. Siege warfare was common, with fortresses designed to withstand prolonged attacks. Supply lines were critical. Without food, water, and fresh troops, armies could not sustain themselves. Battles could be decisive or inconclusive, with victory often determined by discipline, morale, and leadership. The aftermath of warfare could devastate regions, destroying crops, displacing populations, and spreading disease. Yet for nobles, warfare was also a means to gain territory, wealth, and prestige. The culture of chivalry romanticized the role of the knight, but in reality, medieval warfare was brutal, costly, and deeply disruptive to civilian life. Medieval trade networks connected local economies to distant markets. Merchants traveled along overland routes, transporting goods by pack animals or wagons, while ships carried bulk cargo along rivers and across seas. Northern Europe's Hanseatic League dominated Baltic and North Sea trade, while Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa controlled Mediterranean commerce. Exotic goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals flowed into Europe, while wool, timber, and grain were exported. Trade required negotiation of tolls, protection from bandits, and careful navigation of political boundaries. Markets and fairs served as exchange points, where contracts were signed and goods changed hands. The growth of trade encouraged urban expansion, supported craft industries, and contributed to the rise of a merchant class whose wealth rivaled that of traditional nobility. Over time, these networks fostered cultural exchange as much as economic growth, spreading ideas, technologies, and even diseases between regions. Medieval crafts supported daily life through skilled labor. Blacksmiths produced tools, weapons, and horseshoes, essential for agriculture and defense. Carpenters built homes, furniture, and carts, while masons constructed stone buildings from cathedrals to castles. Weavers, dyers, and tailors supplied clothing, with styles and colors reflecting both regional traditions and imported influences. Potters made durable containers for cooking and storage, while leatherworkers created boots, belts, and saddles. Many crafts were organized into guilds that set quality standards, trained apprentices, and protected the interests of their members. Craftsmanship often combined practicality with artistry, as seen in illuminated manuscripts, decorated armor, and intricate wood carving. These trades gave towns their character, with certain places becoming renowned for specific goods. Craft industries not only met local needs, but also generated goods for trade, linking artisans to the broader economic and cultural networks of the medieval world. Medieval festivals blended religious devotion with social celebration. Feast days honored saints, holy events, or seasonal milestones like harvest time. Communities gathered for processions, church services, and shared meals, while musicians, dancers, and actors entertained the crowds. Games, competitions, and tournaments provided excitement, with archery contests and wrestling matches drawing enthusiastic spectators. Festivals were opportunities for socializing, courtship, and reinforcing communal bonds. For peasants, they offered a break from the hard rhythm of agricultural life, while for nobles they were occasions to display wealth and generosity. Markets expanded during festivals as merchants capitalized on the influx of visitors. Religious plays and pageants taught moral lessons, making the events both spiritually uplifting and entertaining. The blending of sacred and secular elements ensured that festivals were among the most anticipated moments of the year, uniting people across social divides in shared celebration. Medieval travel could be both adventurous and perilous. Pilgrims, merchants, and messengers moved along roads that varied from well-kept Roman remnants to muddy tracks. Inns and monasteries provided rest, though comfort and safety differed widely. Bandits, storms, and political conflicts were constant threats. So many traveled in groups for protection. Sea voyages offered faster routes for bulk goods, but they carried risks of shipwreck and piracy. Travel was slow, measured in miles per day rather than hours, yet it brought exposure to new landscapes, languages, and customs. Journeys to fairs, markets, or holy sites became life-changing experiences, expanding horizons beyond one's birthplace. For those who returned safely, Stories of distant lands enriched local culture and inspired curiosity about the wider world. Travel was both a necessity for trade and diplomacy, and a transformative experience for individuals in an age defined by rootedness and tradition. Medieval diplomacy balanced alliances, rivalries, and the ever-shifting political landscape. Envoys traveled between courts, carrying messages, negotiating treaties, and arranging marriages to strengthen ties between noble houses. These missions required tact, as missteps could lead to insult or war. Language barriers were overcome with interpreters, and symbolic gifts reinforced goodwill. Diplomats often operated in an atmosphere of intrigue, with spies gathering intelligence alongside formal negotiations. Religious leaders sometimes mediated disputes, adding moral authority to agreements. Treaties could be sealed with oaths, blessings, or the exchange of hostages to ensure compliance. Diplomacy helped avoid conflict, but could also be used to buy time for military preparation. The success of these delicate exchanges shaped borders, secured trade routes, and influenced the balance of power across regions. In a world where war was costly, diplomacy was a crucial tool for maintaining stability and advancing political ambitions. Medieval justice combined local customs, feudal authority, and religious law. Manorial courts handled disputes over land, debts, and petty crimes, while royal courts tried more serious offenses. Ecclesiastical courts judged cases involving clergy or moral conduct. Punishments ranged from fines and public shaming to imprisonment or execution, depending on the offense and the accused's status. Trial by ordeals such as carrying hot iron or submersion in water reflected the belief in divine judgment. Oaths and witness testimony carried weight, especially in close-knit communities. Justice was often public, reinforcing social order through visibility. For some, the legal system offered protection and recourse. For others, it reflected the inequality of the feudal hierarchy, where wealth and influence could sway outcomes. Despite its inconsistencies, medieval justice provided a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining order in a society where personal honor, communal stability, and religious morality were deeply intertwined. Medieval education evolved from monastic beginnings into universities that shaped intellectual life for centuries. Monasteries preserved classical texts and trained clergy in Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. Cathedral schools expanded learning to future administrators and scholars. By the 12th century, universities emerged in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, attracting students from across Europe. Curricula focused on grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, with advanced studies in medicine, law, and theology. Instruction relied on lectures and debate, with books rare and valuable. Students lived under strict codes, often in simple lodgings near their school. While education remained mostly male and elite, merchant families began to invest in literacy for their children to improve trade prospects. The intellectual foundations laid in this period influenced philosophy, science, and governance, bridging medieval traditions with the Renaissance and shaping the future of European thought. Medieval law enforcement relied heavily on community participation. In villages, neighbors acted as watchmen, reporting crimes and pursuing wrongdoers. Towns employed constables or night watchmen to maintain order, often enforcing curfews and patrolling streets. Sheriffs oversaw larger jurisdictions, ensuring royal authority was upheld. The hue and cry system required all able-bodied men to assist in catching criminals when called upon. Punishments were public, intended to deter others through example, while professional policing as we know it today did not exist. These systems reflected the importance of collective responsibility. In times of unrest, local militias could be called to defend the community or restore peace. The church also played a role, offering sanctuary to accused individuals within its walls. Law enforcement in the medieval period was less about centralized control and more about reinforcing social norms and maintaining stability within closely connected communities. Medieval hospitality was a valued tradition, shaped by necessity and custom. Travelers often depended on the generosity of strangers, especially in rural areas where inns were scarce. Monasteries offered food, shelter, and sometimes medical care, fulfilling religious duties of charity. In towns, guest houses and inns served merchants, pilgrims, and dignitaries, their quality ranging from simple to luxurious. Nobles welcomed important visitors with banquets and entertainment, reinforcing alliances and prestige. Hospitality extended beyond mere lodging. It was an opportunity to display wealth, generosity, and good manners. Refusing aid to a traveler in need could harm a family's reputation. For common people, hosting guests was a communal effort, with neighbors contributing food or space. This culture of hospitality not only facilitated travel but also strengthened bonds between regions, ensuring that kindness and reciprocity were woven into the social fabric of medieval life. Medieval art reflected the values, faith, and daily experiences of the time. Religious themes dominated, with churches and cathedrals adorned in frescoes, mosaics, and stained glass windows that told biblical stories. Illuminated manuscripts combined text and intricate decoration, serving as both devotional objects and works of art. Sculpture adorned church facades, depicting saints, apostles, and moral allegories. Secular art celebrated chivalry, hunting, and courtly life, often appearing in tapestries that decorated noble halls. Local materials and traditions influenced artistic styles, resulting in regional variations across Europe. Artisans worked in guilds, preserving techniques and ensuring quality. While much art served religious or political purposes, it also recorded the details of clothing, architecture, and customs for future generations. The artistry of the medieval period was not only about beauty, it was a means of education, moral instruction, and community identity, leaving a legacy that still shapes cultural heritage today. Medieval sports and games offered recreation and fostered community spirit. Archery, wrestling, and foot races were popular among commoners, while nobles enjoyed hunting, jousting, and falconry. Board games like chess and backgammon provided mental challenge, while dice games and gambling added excitement to tavern life. Seasonal festivals often included competitions, with winners gaining prestige or small prizes. These activities broke the monotony of daily labor and allowed people to test their skills in friendly rivalry. For knights, tournaments were both sport and training, sharpening their martial abilities while entertaining spectators. Even simple games played by children in village greens or castle courtyards reflected the creativity and energy of medieval life. Sports served as a unifying force, bridging social divides during moments of shared enjoyment, and reinforcing bonds within both rural and urban communities. Medieval literature encompassed epic poetry, romances, religious texts, and historical chronicles. Works like the Song of Roland and Beowulf celebrated heroism and loyalty, while Arthurian legends blended chivalry with myth. Courtly love poetry explored themes of passion, honor, and moral restraint. Religious writings guided spiritual life, from sermons to mystical visions recorded by saints. Chronicles documented wars, politics, and natural events, often mixing fact with interpretation. Storytelling was also oral, with bards and minstrels passing down local legends and family histories. Manuscripts were labor-intensive to produce, making books rare and valuable possessions. Literature was both entertainment and moral instruction, reflecting the values and conflicts of the time. These works connected audiences across generations, preserving cultural memory and shaping the ideals that defined medieval identity. Medieval philosophy sought to reconcile faith with reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Peter Abelard, and William of Ockham explored theological questions through logic and debate. Scholasticism, the dominant method, relied on structured argumentation, often using classical texts as starting points. Universities became centers for philosophical study, where students engaged in disputations to defend or challenge ideas. Philosophy addressed issues of morality, law, and governance, influencing both religious and secular life. The integration of Aristotelian thought through translations from the Islamic world enriched intellectual discourse, while firmly rooted in Christian doctrine. Medieval philosophy laid foundations for later developments in science, politics, and ethics. It demonstrated the era's commitment to understanding the world through both divine revelation and human reasoning, creating a legacy that bridged ancient traditions and modern inquiry. Medieval legacy continues to shape the modern world in architecture, language, law, and cultural traditions. Gothic cathedrals still stand as engineering marvels. Towns retain street patterns from their medieval origins, and many legal principles trace back to feudal contracts and customary law. Literature, art, and music from the period inspire contemporary works, while historical reenactments keep medieval crafts and customs alive. The values of community cooperation, hospitality, and moral duty echo in present-day societies. Understanding the medieval world offers insight into the roots of modern institutions and the resilience of human creativity in times of hardship. Its blend of hardship and beauty, war and peace, faith, and doubt, continues to fascinate scholars and the public alike, ensuring that the medieval era remains a vital part of our shared cultural memory. That brings us to the end of our journey through the medieval world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and donate through the link provided in the description to support more content like this. Your support keeps history alive and helps bring these stories to more people around the world.